This video is made possible by the Great Courses Plus, an on-demand video learning service. Learn at your own pace with no tests or schedules. Check out a free trial from the Great Courses Plus through the link in the description below. More about them a little later. We've been fighting wars ever since we started having disputes with others and had enough people on both sides willing to fight for it. Even if warfare has changed quite a bit from its early days, the basic rules have always remained the same. It's usually the side with conventional numerical and technological superiority that wins, regardless of other factors. Well, usually. In a handful of cases, armies without a clear advantage on the battlefield, or even with an outright disadvantage in some rare instances, have prevailed over their numerically and technologically superior foes because of their on-the-fly, clever military tactics. While some of these battle maneuvers are still studied in history classes around the world, some have been forgotten due to the larger outcomes of their respective wars. Number 8. The Matchbook Tactic. The Second World War was full of creative military tactics from both sides, though only some of them turned out to be successful. One of them was Britain convincing German soldiers to abandon their posts and get sent off for medical reasons. As they couldn't exactly just go up to them and tell them about it, they decided the best way to do it was to print it on matchbooks and airdrop them behind enemy lines. The matchbooks contained specific instructions on how to fake illnesses like skin inflammations and lung problems. They were counting on German soldiers to go along with the plan too, as almost anyone would take sitting in a hospital bed somewhere over fighting in a war. To everyone's surprise, as it was admittedly a rather far-fetched plan, they were largely successful, though probably not in the way they had intended. The German commanders got wind of the idea and refused to send anyone to quarantine or medical care, except some German soldiers who were really sick, as wars tend to do that to people. These soldiers were forced to stay and fight, and ended up spreading a real disease among the German army. This tactic also sowed mistrust between the German soldiers and their commanders. Number 7. Fake your own death. If you know anything about the history of Norway, you know of Harald Sigurdsson, also known as Harald Hardrada. Perhaps the most well-known Norwegian king, he was best known for his military successes in Eastern Europe after his brother got usurped by Canute, popularly known as Canute the Great. He spent quite some time in eastern parts before he got the throne, working as a mercenary for the Byzantine Empire. He was good at it too, proven by his clever tactics and victories on the battlefield. One particularly striking instance was when he besieged a minor settlement that just wouldn't give up. While most people would just get frustrated and go home or rush in to fight, he came up with an ingenious plan. He asked his men to place him in a coffin and tell the besieged forces that he was dead. In a spectacular lapse of judgment, the townspeople believed them and even allowed him to be buried inside of the city walls. To no one's surprise, other than the villagers, he burst out of his coffin with a sword with a few of his men as soon as they were inside the city walls. He was able to take the town with the help of just a handful of his soldiers, presumably pointing and laughing at the enemy through all of it. Number 6. Operation Uranus. Enough has been talked about the German defeat in the Second World War, though mostly in the context of its battles in the West. The majority of us know about their Russian campaign is that it was brutal and that you should never attempt to invade Russia in the winter. While that's accurate, we forget that the Nazis were actually well on their way to success in the beginning, and if it wasn't for some dynamic thinking by Stalin and Soviet leadership, the war would have ended very differently. The flashpoint of the Eastern Theater was the Battle of Stalingrad, which was by far the biggest confrontation of any war in history because of the sheer numbers involved. It wasn't always going well for the Russians, though, as the Germans were quite comfortably winning as long as their supply lines remained intact. Stalin knew that, and he asked his generals to undertake a risky yet smart maneuver to encircle the Germans. Known as Operation Uranus, it redirected the supplies needed for the Russian forces fighting in the city to two forces from the north and south of the city. Their aim was to get behind the German flanks and cut off their supply lines, and then encircle them in a classic pincer maneuver. Perhaps it was love for the motherland or fear of what Stalin would do to them if they failed, though the Russian forces turned out to be successful. They cut off the German supply chain and had them surrounded, which proved to be the turning point of the battle. Again, we cannot emphasize the importance of this maneuver enough, as the German forces winning Stalingrad would have been catastrophic for the Allies and the world. Now, just before we get into the top 5 today, I want to take a quick moment to tell you about today's sponsor, the Great Courses Plus. On the Great Courses Plus, you can learn from the world's best professors and educators. Now, if you're enjoying this video, there's a lot of military content on their platform, particularly if you're enjoying this specific episode. Why not check out the opposite side of things with their course, History's Greatest Military Blunders? That's a lot of fun. They also look at what people can learn from those, and if you're enjoying this one, I think you'll enjoy that. Or you can check out their course on the essential secrets of spices, because the Great Courses Plus is nothing if not diverse. Basically, it's like a university education, but at your own pace. There are no tests, there are no schedules, and it's incredibly easy to access. Do it on a PC, tablet, phone, wherever. They've also got audio streaming, so you can listen on the move, which is very convenient. And of course, there are thousands of lectures to choose from. So yes, it's all rather great stuff. Try it out for free. Start your free trial at thegreatcoursesplus.com/TopTenz, or just click the link in the description below. Doing that helps support this show. And let's get back to the rest of today's video. Number 5. The empty city tactic. What do you do when a force of 150,000 troops is marching on your town and all you have to defend it is a loose unit of about 100 men? If a genius ancient Chinese military commander is to be believed, the correct answer is to open the gates and sit on top of the walls playing your lute. This feat was accomplished by Zhuge Liang, also Zhu Liang, who was commanding the Shu Kingdom's forces against the Wei's in the War of the Three Kingdoms. Now, the situation wasn't as dire on other fronts, as the Shus commanded a sizable army of their own. They just didn't anticipate an advance on this town, as Liang had already sent the bulk of his forces to fight elsewhere. Faced with the full might of his enemies, he had to come up with a plan. What they did would eventually be known as the empty fort strategy, which has since been used to great success in a few other battles in history. Counting on his reputation for cunning and military prowess, he asked his men to take down the city flags and retreat. He then proceeded to climb atop the walls and started playing his lute. Sima Yi, the general of the commanding Wei forces, recognized him and ordered a retreat of his own forces. He thought that Liang had an ambush set up, as he wasn't known to be the sort of man who would be caught unprepared without any plans of his own. It worked, and the Wei army left them alone. Number 4. Battle of Ilipa. Some of the most famous military maneuvers in history were executed by ancient Roman commanders, and war history students still study them to this day. One of them was Scipio Africanus in his victory over Hannibal's forces in the Battle of Ilipa in Spain. Both of their forces were made up of Iberian mercenaries and well-trained forces of their own. While Scipio did a lot of things right in that battle, one of his best decisions was reversing the order of his formation exactly when the Carthaginians weren't expecting it. Commanded by Hannibal's brother Mago and one of his best commanders, Hasdrubal Gisco, the Carthaginians had initially arranged their lines in the same way as the Romans. They had their well-trained soldiers in the middle and the mercenaries on the flanks, as it was the best course of action. While the battle continued as a stalemate for a few days, it changed when Scipio suddenly decided to reverse the order, placing his mercenaries in the middle. They did a great job at holding the center of the Carthaginian forces, while the Roman flanks harassed and eventually broke their flanks. Despite being outnumbered by some 10,000 men and sort of on a losing streak to Hannibal in the recent past, the Roman forces prevailed. The battle marked a turning point in the Roman war against Carthage and is still celebrated as one of the best military maneuvers of all time. Number 3. Battle of the Hydaspes. Alexander was by far one of the most brilliant commanders in history. Owing to his prowess on the battlefield, he would regularly engage numerically superior enemies and win. He never lost a battle and took Macedonia from a tiny city-state to one of the largest empires in all of human history. What we don't know, however, is how close he came to defeat during his Indian campaign. Defeating Persian and Greek kingdoms was one thing, though marching on Indian kingdoms was a whole different game altogether. That didn't dissuade him, though, and he marched on the forces of King Porus of Punjab near the Jhelum River. With the clearly numerically superior enemy army on the other side of the river blocking his way, he had to come up with a plan, and he promptly did so. In one of the best maneuvers in history, he left a part of his forces to face Porus and took the majority of his army to cross the river some 17 miles away. Porus got wind of this plan and moved his position to face the bulk of Alexander's forces. He didn't know it then, but he had already set himself up for eventual defeat. Alexander marched on Porus's forces, including 200 war elephants with his trademark phalanxes, and sent some cavalry to further outflank him. While Alexander was losing in the beginning, the flanking maneuver, including the arrival of the rest of his remaining forces from earlier, completely routed the massive army of Porus. Number 2. Using your own bad reputation as an advantage. Ancient China was an especially bloody period of world history, with many independent states as well as big factions fighting for control of its vast lands. One of those independent states was Qi, facing off against the mighty Wei forces. The Qi forces were renowned for their incompetence, as they weren't particularly trained and were known to desert a lot and were kind of just bad soldiers. The Wei forces, commanded by Pang Chuang, knew that and probably didn't think much of the advancing army once war was declared between the two. What he failed to realize is that the Qi forces had a particularly brilliant military tactician for this war, Sun Bin, on their side. A descendant of the greatest strategist of all time, Sun Tzu, Sun Bin had an old rivalry against Chuan, which is probably why he was keen to help. He devised a brilliant strategy to make it seem like his forces were deserting by reducing the number of fires lit at night in his camp during the advance. The Wei forces, presuming that it was because of classic Qi deserters, didn't think much of it and waited for the advancing army. As you'd have guessed, the Qi forces overwhelmed the Wei army easily, as they had no idea that they were facing a full army of 100,000 men. Chuan even committed suicide by slitting his throat at the end of it. Number 1. Inventing a whole new formation on the fly. Napoleon can safely be placed on any list of the best military tacticians of all time. It's an especially noteworthy achievement, as all the armies he was fighting were on equal footing with him in terms of technology and military experience, unlike others like Alexander and Genghis Khan. While he has a long list of impressive military maneuvers to be mentioned here, we'll focus on his Egyptian campaign. The Mamluks had a formidable cavalry, which outnumbered his own cavalry by at least 2 to 1. Where most other European armies would have faced certain defeat, Napoleon won due to his ingenious hollowed square formation. He placed his artillery, cavalry, and baggage in the middle of the square, which were more rectangles than squares, as they had twice the number of soldiers on their length and breadth. The formation was insanely maneuverable and difficult to flank, as it was able to respond to flanking tricks from nearly all sides. He barely lost any soldiers, and by the end of it, all the Mamluk forces were routed as he successfully marched on Cairo. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Do not forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. For more from me, why not check out another channel I do called Biographics. We've indeed done biographies on that channel of some of the people in today's video. So check it out, linked to below. And as always, thank you for watching.